really appreciate it. And I agree with what you said. Support your local independent bookstore because they're the ones who really champion authors. They always have really great book recommendations and they get to know you and then they can recommend even more great books. So that's always a thing. So to start out, I guess I'll talk just briefly for a minute here, and then I'll do a reading, and then I'll come back and do some more talking about how psychedelics can be of benefit in general, specifically psilocybin. So one of the things I really was fascinated about was that I learned when I started digging into the research that women report more frequent use of some psychedelics than men. And that really surprised me. I just thought that more men would be using psychedelics. But when I dug a little deeper into the research, I wasn't that surprised because the not so fun fact here is that women actually cite women use psychedelics to self-treat as opposed to using them recreationally. There's nothing wrong with using psychedelics recreationally. Men tend to do that a little bit more. Again, nothing wrong with that. But I am finding that women are using psychedelics to self-treat, and they cite depression, anxiety, relationship issues, trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder as their main reasons for using psychedelics. So that's kind of a depressing fact. But the beauty of this is that we are learning a lot from the research that's coming out to suggest that psychedelics can be of benefit for these conditions. But yeah, I think it's disappointing that women have to turn to psychedelics to self-treat. But the reason that they're doing that is because they're not getting adequate quick care in the medical system for many conditions. And there's research to support this, and I'll dive into some of that. But one thing I like to share about this to sort of illustrate that sometimes women's health is left on the back burner in the mainstream medical system is this little timeline that I like to share. And so it wasn't until the early 1990s that women were actually starting to be included in clinical trials. Before that, they were largely excluded for various reasons. And this has had a lot of ramifications for women's health. So we can think about this from the perspective of a timeline of when men got a drug for a condition to when women got a drug for a condition. So I always like to share this timeline, but it's really upsetting. So men got a drug for male sexual dysfunction in 1998, and everyone knows the name of that drug. It's Viagra. It's a household name, right? Well, at that point in time, the medical community, let alone anyone that a woman was sleeping with, didn't have an adequate picture or a complete picture of what the clitoris looks like. So there's actually all this internal structure to the clitoris. And that wasn't discovered until 2005 when a female urologist, Dr. Helen O'Connell, yay, Helen O'Connell, she did some MRI work and determined that there's all this internal structure to the clitoris. Now, fast forward till 2015, that's when women finally got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. And that's a 17-year gap from when men got a drug for a condition to when women got a drug for a condition. This is even more alarming when we consider the statistics here. So women of reproductive age, or people assigned female at birth of reproductive age, the statistic is that 40% of them have some type of female sexual dysfunction. That statistic goes up quite a bit once people get into menopause. Then it becomes 85%. So when you think about that men got a drug for a condition in 1998, and women who are disproportionately affected by the same condition, even though it affects us differently, not until 2015. So yeah, so that's the state of women's health. It's just that oftentimes women's health is put on the back burner. So that's really why this book exists, that women are turning to psychedelics to self-treat. And we are finding that the reason that they're turning to psychedelics to self-treat is because the mainstream medical system is often leaving them behind. Now, I'm not against the mainstream medical system. I want to make that clear. I am a fact checker. I'm a science and medical journalist. I love medicine. I love science. Huge proponent of it. What I'm not a proponent of is forgetting about women's health, and that's happening. So with that, I'm going to do a short reading, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about the female body and the intersection of psilocybin with the female body. So this is the first chapter of the book. There's a whole introduction, but but I don't want to read that. I'll just dive into the first chapter. And the first chapter really explores my own experience with psilocybin. I did a journey, I did a little personalized retreat last year. And so this dives into the first part of that. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it's pretty long, but I really wanted to include my personal experience because I think a lot of times when we talk about psychedelics, it feels like a very abstract thing, especially if you've never tried them before. And so it helps to hear other people's stories. So I've got my own story in the book, and then I've also interviewed other women throughout the book. And there's several different chapters on women's stories who've used psilocybin in some way to some effect. So one woman, she used psilocybin to heal from an eating disorder, another from trauma related to having ADHD, and I can explain that more later. And then someone else, it was using psilocybin for anxiety and depression, but also as a tool in her relationship with her husband. So I thought that was a really special chapter as well. Okay, so this is my story. I'm going to a cabin in the woods to do drugs with two people I've never met. And I've sent them a bunch of money. Yep, when I say it out loud to friends or family, I hear how it sounds, like I've thrown caution into a tornado or that I'm attempting to live out a horror movie plot. I pack my bag. When I'm close to my destination, I pull over to text my husband, Jeremy. I tell him I've made it and that I'm about to drive up the mountain to the house. He writes back, "Bye forever." I shake my head and laugh, and then I put the SUV in drive and wind up a narrow, rutted road. Jeremy's only kidding. He knows I've done my research, but his message is symbolic. Perhaps he really is saying bye to what will eventually be the former me, someone who won't come back down this mountain. I meet Gabriel Castillo and Bridget Rivera at the remote cabin perched above the treetops. After giving me a few moments to shake off the drive, take in the view, and gulp the fresh air, Rivera smudges me by burning dried sage, a symbolic gesture to cleanse me of negative thoughts. She runs the smoke along my whole body, doing the soles of my feet one at a time, requiring an unexpected test of my balance, which feels off at such great heights. I pitch forward and grab the deck railing. When I laugh at myself, Rivera doesn't leave me hanging. She chuckles with me, and I instantly like her. Castillo's guided meditation gives thanks to the east, south, west, and north, as well as the earth below that holds us and whatever may be above. I marvel at his words, considering that I'm about to embark on some serious navigation in my mind. He invites me to take the medicine. I start with 1 gram of psilocybin that Castillo has ground into a powder and placed in a capsule. The strain is Cambodian, named for where it was found. It's known for its therapeutic journey, he tells me. I lie beneath a weighted blanket on a cushioned floor mat and pull on an eye mask that obliterates all light. Castillo speaks of guided meditation into a microphone. His voice is soothing but disembodied. On either side of me, both Castillo and Rivera play quartz singing bowls, bathing me in sound. Time passes, but I'm unaware of how much. I simply ease into a meditation. Eventually, Castillo invites me to ingest more medicine. So I sit up, grab the pill bottle he's placed beside my mat, and swallow another gram. The whole experience is at first much like an amazing meditative shavasana or corpse pose in yoga, traditionally included as a wind down at the end of a session. But soon I enter something much deeper. I am connected by threads of light to all the people I hold dear, located in different places. I visualize my friends and family as points on a map. My love for them flows along the threads to the points, and their love for me courses back. I think of fungi's wood wide web, that underground network that sends nourishment to plants in need in an ecosystem, and I'm in awe. Just imagine being able to feel the love and everyone who loves you, as if all that love were surging on an electrical current. What a gift. Their collective tenderness swaddles and cradles me. I'm safe inside it and allow my mind to take me places I have previously been afraid to go. The mushroom acts as a Kool-Aid man crashing through the walls I've carefully constructed to protect me. A loved one has wounded me repeatedly in recent years, and if I'm being honest, the harm goes back much further. Time and distance have allowed a scarring over, but scarring leaves tougher skin to prevent future hurt. I've got a well of unconditional love for this person, one I keep covered. You do not leave such wells open lest you fall in. Now in my mushroom meditation, I readily access my love, compassion, and empathy for them. I explore cherished but bittersweet memories of us. We're fishing, we're floating down the river, we're making up a secret wave for farmers we pass on the road. Hurt cannot steal who I am or my love for this person or these memories. These things are mine, and no one, no matter how much they gaslight me, can take them from me. My eyes leak behind the mask, but here's the thing, I'm not sad. Castillo invites me to take more medicine. I like where I'm at and abstain. I still have another day to go deeper if I choose, and I will. The mushroom crashes through another wall in my mind. I access the memory of Fiverr, our Skipper Key dog who passed away a year ago at age 11. We're running on a grassy back trail that's glittery with sunlight sneaking through the trees. The memory becomes tangible with the tug of his leash pulling me down his choice of snaking path. The moment is from the last time we were able to run together, just before he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure from a congenital valve defect. Jeremy and I spent the next 2 years pouring all our energy into caring for Fiverr, knowing the day would come when we'd have to let him go. But how do you let go of your living, breathing, panting, licking your face security blanket? The mushroom takes me to the vet clinic. I do not fight it. I'm holding Fiverr for the last time. I kiss his forehead and inhale his scent to the bottom of my lungs, where it will imprint on my alveoli, where it will then flow into my heart to be pumped to my every cell. With him in my lap, I curl my body over his fluffy frame. He takes his last breath. More tears wet the eye mask, but I am not sad. Fiverr and I are together, and that will never change. I've lost 2 friends recently and unexpectedly, one to an opioid overdose and one to natural causes when he collapsed on a street in New Orleans. I'd met both men in my 20s and they became stalwart forces in my life. The losses of these beautiful humans have left me feeling as if a part of the past has also perished or been chopped off from my existence. In grieving them, I've also grieved the loss of the magical time when they first entered and became such a big part of my universe. When you lose pivotal people, you grieve them, of course, but you either knowingly or subconsciously also grieve a part of yourself because you are losing someone who witnessed different snapshots, iterations of you. That time is still there. The mushroom shows me. It's still a part of me, and the me who lived that time is also still me. Ultimately, these men are with me and always will be. I am no longer severed from the past, but threaded tightly to it. Eventually, Castillo's gentle voice pulls me back into the room. Through guided meditation, he reacquaints me with my body and the space around me. I wiggle my fingers and toes, then my limbs. I've been so deep in my mind that it takes me a moment to adjust. I ask him how much time has passed. 3 hours, he says, and my mouth drops open. I grab my journal and scribble furiously. Castillo prepares dinner in the kitchen, giving me time to engage with my thoughts, but making his presence known so that I feel safe if any heaviness crops up. At dinner, I nibble at my food, even though the pesto pasta Castillo's prepared is delicious. My body is filled with warmth and love, and I need no sustenance. But I'll be real, doing mushrooms can also temporarily kill your appetite. As we eat, Castillo and Rivera invite me to share about my experience. They are strangers, but somehow that fact makes it easier for me to tell them everything. I talk mostly about the one who has hurt me. Before leaving for this trip, oh, the pun, I texted a friend who has experience with mushrooms. I'm worried my trip will be all about blank. He wrote back immediately, if it is, it will likely be healing. So far, he's correct. That night, my brain is busy, but it doesn't spin like it often does before bed. It's busy exploring the open spaces inside it. No longer is it a labyrinth with potential dead ends, scary dark corners, or covered wells. Instead, I can see where I am, as if on a windswept prairie in my home state. No skyscrapers blocking the view. I'm safe where I go. I think about the one who has hurt me repeatedly and how that's impacted my life over the decade. I am being cryptic about who this person is, and that is for their privacy. But this relationship represents such a core wound for me, one that has harmed me far more than I've ever realized or been willing to let myself understand before this moment. I've kept others, but not all, at arm's length. I make new friends easily and I love them without reserve. Even though I trust my friends, I don't always truly trust the friendship. I'm secretly waiting for the stick of dynamite to blow up the foundation. I'm not proud of the way I've let someone have so much power over me, but in this afterglow of the mushroom, I do not judge myself as I normally would. I recognize that the dynamics were put in place when I was a kid. I have empathy for the young girl I was. I am still her. I am proud of of myself for showing her compassion and helping her grow instead of remaining stuck. I see a path forward toward healing and potential change. I can continue to love from afar this person who has hurt me while protecting myself from further harm. Why do I love this person unconditionally? I've asked myself that question before, and a wise person once told me, because that's the definition of love. That's the definition of love, to love unconditionally. But also, I know that the actions of the person who has hurt me are not born out of malice. I lie awake for what seems like hours, exploring the reaches of my mind's expanse. Out of my room's window, a lightning storm flickers, and I watch in awe until finally my brain is ready to rest. I'll stop reading right there. The chapter does go on and covers the next day of my journey, in which I do go much deeper and explore some serious things. And I think it might be of interest for people to read. But getting back to just kind of talking about psilocybin, I think one of the common questions that I get, and I'll start with this, is how does psilocybin actually affect us? How does it really work? So, we hear from all this research coming out right now that it's beneficial for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, many other things it's being studied for right now, lots of clinical trials going on. But just to give you a little bit of a nutshell of how psilocybin might be effective for people, researchers have developed this model to sort of explain it, and it's called the Rebus model. That stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, and this model was created by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris and Dr. Carl J. Friston, and they're prolific psychedelic researchers. But again, the Rebus model, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, what this means is, so looking back to childhood, our minds were really flexible. We hadn't formulated our identities yet. We hadn't really determined who we are or how the world around us operates. We were still learning all of that. So in that time period, our minds were what's called very entropic or flexible. When we get into adulthood, our minds become much more rigid. And that's because we have solidified all those pathways of thinking about ourselves, and we've developed our identities. Yes, they're still developing and they can continue to develop, but we've really solidified some pathways of thinking about ourselves, and some of those can be really negative and may not serve us very well. And again, same thing with how the world around us operates. We may have locked into some pathways of thinking about that don't really help us out much. And so if we are to try to change those mindsets, if we try to change those pathways of thinking, it can be very difficult. And that's because in a normal state of consciousness, our minds are super rigid. So I'm in a normal state of consciousness right now, and those pathways of thinking are rigid. And we can think of them almost like a frozen pond. So you've got ice, right? Now, if you were to try to take a new belief, so let's say you have social anxiety or something like that, and you're trying to convince yourself that no, you are like, it is okay to go out in public and be around people. People like me. I'm a good person. Let's say you're trying to change your belief about meaning that before you've had this negative belief that you're not good in social situations. If you were to try to change that belief, you take a rock, like think of it as a rock, because we've got our frozen pond. Now we're going to think of having a rock, and in the rock is in the form of a new belief, and you're going to drop that rock on the pond, and it's frozen, it's ice. It's not going to gain entry. It might cause a crack, but it doesn't really do anything, right? Now, when you're on a psychedelic, so here comes the idea of this relaxed belief. Think of that pond now as being thawed. You've got water. Now take that belief in the form of a rock, drop it in, it gains entry, and it causes a ripple effect, which can be, having a lasting effect by having this belief change. So you can see how psychedelics can help you actually change your mind about not only yourself, but how the world around you operates. So this, again, can be really beneficial for things like PTSD, trauma, anxiety, depression, and just just concepts that really aren't serving us in our lives. So another concept I want to describe for psychedelics is the helioscope effect. So this concept can describe why when we're on a psychedelic, we can actually reprocess trauma, but in a safe way. So a helioscope, and this helioscope effect was created by I think it was a doctor named Gregor Hassler. I just always like to give credit where credit is due. But a helioscope is an instrument that we use to look at the sun, or not, maybe not all of us, but scientists use it because you're not supposed to look directly at the sun, right? You'll get burned, your eyes will. So a helioscope is an instrument to safely do that. And it has some filters on it where, again, you can safely look at the sun, but also you view it from a different perspective almost. And so that's kind of cool. And when you're on a psychedelic, we have this similar thing going on. That's why the researchers have created this idea of the helioscope effect. But you can view trauma without getting burned, essentially. So normally in normal states of consciousness, when we think about traumatic events or trauma that has occurred in our lives, we get triggered by that. We get really anxious, we get upset, and we avoid looking at those things. So it's almost like we're avoiding looking at the sun, right? But with this helioscope effect going on, when you're on a psychedelic, including psilocybin, you can view that trauma from a safe distance without feeling that anxiety, that stress, that panic. And you're viewing it from a new lens, essentially, with these filters on it. So you might gain a different perspective. So this is why, in many cases, psychedelics can help us reprocess trauma and heal from that trauma. That's why it tends to be effective. But psychedelics are being studied for things other than just mental health conditions, which are, of course, extremely important to research and find new treatments for, because we don't have really good existing treatments or treatments on the market right now that are good. I mean, we have some, but they're not always effective for everyone. But I'm going to come back to talking about mental health issues and psilocybin. But I want to jump ahead and talk a little bit about the female body and psilocybin, because one of the things that I want to share is that psilocybin may affect the female body a little bit differently. And there is research to support this. So we do know that estrogen affects the serotonin receptors. So psilocybin, when you take psilocybin, it binds to your serotonin receptors, and estrogen does something with the binding at the site. So we don't know all the logistics yet of that. Researchers are still trying to figure that out. But it is possible that where we are in our cycles matters when we're using psilocybin. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to dig into just briefly explaining different dosages so you understand some of the terms that I'm throwing out there. And some of you may already be familiar with this, so just ignore me for a minute. But in terms of doses, the journey that I was just describing, that was about 2 grams. And the next day I did a 3.5 gram journey. And so those journeys would be considered macro doses. And these are typically amounts that are used in clinical trials for studying psilocybin. But this is when you are classically like tripping, right? And so tripping would be like we're seeing some, psychedelic visuals, like, vibrant colors, and then geometric patterns, some of the classic things that you've seen on TV or film when there's a movie about someone doing mushrooms. That sort of thing is happening, but also you've got these really great beneficial effects happening in your mind. And then I also want to cover the term microdose. So a microdose is a much tinier, minuscule dose. It's about 1/10 of a gram. So comparing that to a macrodose where we're talking 2 or 3 grams, a microdose is 1/10 of a gram. So it's such a small amount. And macro dosing is something that people do maybe like once or twice a year, maybe 4 times a year. It's not something you do super regularly. Microdosing, though, however, is something you might do much more regularly. And so there are different microdosing protocols where you would be, taking that microdose a few days a week and then a few days off, or it might be every other day. Again, there are a bunch of different protocols, and I share some of those in the book. But I wanted to explain that because also a microdose, it's important to know that you aren't really having psychedelic effects on that, meaning you're not going to have those visuals. You could still drive on a microdose. It would be imperceptible to you, other than that it kind of takes the edge off the day, in that you might have less stress or anxiety, you may have more focus, things like that. So just wanted to explain that before I went further talking about the female body. with psilocybin. So researchers dug into whether or not psilocybin does impact the menstrual cycle. And I'm really excited about this research because I do see some potential for helping with conditions like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, or in my case, endometriosis, which is a condition that I have that affects 1 in 10 people assigned female at birth. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But in terms of the menstrual cycle, Johns Hopkins University has been studying psilocybin with this, and they've really, right now, all we have are case studies and anecdotal reports, so we don't have clinical trials on this yet, but I imagine that those will come down the pipeline pretty soon. But what they determined is that from these case studies and anecdotal reports, they're learning that people who've done macro doses of psilocybin, their cycles came a little early, so they got their periods a little early. And then also, in some cases, people returned to having regular cycles after a time of irregularity. So people might be irregular from some of these conditions that I just mentioned, or some people had an absence of their period for a while. I'm not talking about menopause, but just like even in your reproductive times where your period stops, and that can happen for many different reasons. But in some cases, people got their periods back after a time of amenorrhea when they did not have a period. So that was really fascinating too. And I'm so excited that researchers are studying this. So if you want to know a little bit more about some of the mechanisms at play here, I always like to explain mechanisms because it helps us understand our body a little bit better. And of course, this sort of stuff really fascinates me. I could geek out over it for days. But our menstrual cycle occurs along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So that, by gonads, I mean ovaries for the female body. But what I mean by that is that our cycle occurs in a feedback loop. When one hormone kicks off, it tells another hormone what to do. And that's why we have our follicular phase, followed by the ovulation phase, and then the luteal phase, and then we get our periods, and it all starts over again, right? So that's how that works. But when we also have another axis in our bodies, and everyone has this axis as well, it's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this axis involves our stress response. And so when we use psilocybin, we are activating serotonin receptors in our body. And that is along that HPA axis. And just by the names of these axes, they overlap by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So it's not a stretch to assume that one impacts the other, right? And we already know this. We know this from science, that if you are stressed, that can affect your menstrual cycle. If you are on your period, that can create more stress for you sometimes. You know, we all know this as women. And so it's not a stretch to assume that if we're activating something along that HPA axis, that would affect the menstrual cycle, or vice versa, where we are in our menstrual cycle might affect our journeys of when we're tripping. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about that because it's important to discuss when we're talking about the female body, rather than treating it the same as the male body, because it's not. And then I also wanted to share, so when I was diving into this research on this, I interviewed an Indigenous wisdom expert. And I think that's so important to bring in and discuss anytime we're talking about psychedelics, especially psilocybin, because psilocybin is a sacred substance and it's been traditionally used by Indigenous cultures. And we have a long history of that. And, you know, oftentimes we think of science as a process of doing something over and over again to reproduce the same results. That's, you know, what we think of mainstream science, which is great. And that's important. But we know we have a process of doing something over and over again to reproduce the same results in Indigenous cultures. So we need to bring that in, and we need to honor the traditions of why we even have psilocybin in our society in the first place. You know, I think that's really, really important to consider. So I talked to an Indigenous wisdom expert about her recommendations in terms of the menstrual cycle. And she has a long history of practicing what she calls womb care. And she uses psilocybin in this practice for people who are interested in that. Her name, by the way, if anyone is interested, is Michaela De La Mico. She goes by Mama De La Mico on Instagram, so you can easily find her if you want to follow her videos and things like that. She's just a prolific, person in this space. But she talked about how if you are closer to your period, it's probably better to do a journey when you're closer to ovulation. And that's simply because as we get closer to our periods, our bodies become a little bit more depleted with energy. And that's because all of the energy in our bodies is being shuttled towards the womb, right? But when we're closer to ovulation, excuse me, we have more energy available to us to do a journey, and a journey can be very depleting for the body. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is that oftentimes people will do a little fasting before a journey. That might just be in the hours leading up to doing a journey, or it could be in the days leading up to. And it's harder to fast when we are closer to our periods. We've all had cravings before. I mean, if you're someone listening who has, the female body and has menstruated, then you know that sometimes we get cravings towards that time. And there's a reason for that. That's because in the luteal phase, our bodies are much more insulin resistant, because again, all the glucose and stuff is being shuttled towards the womb. So it also makes sense from a scientific perspective what Michaela De La Mica was talking about. And then the other thing that she recommended is that if you're planning to microdose for perhaps seeing how that affects your menstrual cycle, because many people are doing that, that if you are planning to do that, to microdose, follow whatever protocol you're going to follow for about 3 months, and keep track of it, whether that's through a journal, in terms of your symptoms that you're having, or if it's changing anything with the condition that you have. Do that for 3 months so that you really know how it affects you, because it can take a while to see these effects. So that was just something I wanted to share regarding the menstrual cycle. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about menopause. So a big question that I get is, can psilocybin help with menopause? And to do that, I want to explain a little bit about some of the symptoms that can come up in menopause. So one of the most common symptoms is depression. And that can arise for people who've never had depression before. It can just happen suddenly as we're in that perimenopause leading up to menopause, or even after, or during or after menopause. So one of the most common things that will happen is if you go to your doctor to be treated for depression during menopause, they will likely prescribe you with a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and that's an SSRI for short. And these are great medications. They've worked for many people. They don't work for everyone, but they do also have side effects, and that's a big consideration. One of the side effects is low libido for SSRIs. I mean, again, that doesn't happen to everybody, but it can. And one of the symptoms and other major symptoms of menopause is female sexual dysfunction. So if you've got low libido on top of that, that can exacerbate female sexual dysfunction. So again, SSRIs are great medications, and I respect them. And I certainly don't want to encourage anyone to go off of their SSRIs if they're working for them. But what I do want to raise the question for is for people who haven't been on one. If you go to your doctor and they're like, oh, I'm going to put you on an SSRI, it might be something that you want to say, oh, wait, maybe I don't want to be on that. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying it's something to think about. And the reason for that is because SSRIs, not only do they blunt your lows, they also blunt your highs. So that can impact you leaning into some of the joys in your life. Whereas psilocybin, and there's research to support this, psilocybin does not blunt your mood. Instead, what research shows is that it can actually make you feel more okay with your highs and lows. So when you do have days that you're having a little bit of depression, it might make you feel okay with that, or like to understand that, oh, the joy is around the corner. So I think that's something to consider with when you're weighing your options. Again, I'm not saying anything negative about SSRIs other than that they do have side effects. The other thing to consider is when you do take an SSRI, you're taking that every day, right? That's how they work. With psilocybin, you don't need to do that. You could do a journey and do one journey and then have lasting effects. We're seeing different studies have shown different things, but we're seeing potentially up to a year to combat depression symptoms. So that's another really important consideration. The other thing I wanted to dive into is that if you've had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, so adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short, these are things that occurred in childhood that were traumatic, and these could be anything from having abuse and neglect in the household, living through systemic racism, living in extreme poverty, or parents having a very volatile divorce, having a parent who's incarcerated. These are all things that are called ACEs, and they actually affect our stress response permanently. So they alter your stress response in childhood, and that has lasting effects in adulthood, including as we get closer to menopause. Your menopause symptoms are more likely to be worse if you've had 4 or more ACEs. So that's something really to consider. So it's worth working on your trauma in whatever ways possible, including potentially using a psychedelic in a therapeutic setting to resolve some of these traumas to perhaps have lessened side effects in menopause or symptoms of menopause. And I think we also need to reframe some of the ways that we talk about menopause, and I'm guilty of that. I'm saying side effects and symptoms, but menopause is also a very important transition period in our lives. And if we start thinking about it as this important transition period instead, that can have an effect as well. And then I wanted to dive into parenting just briefly. So because I'm talking about ACEs, this is really relevant to parenting. So I've been, kind of diving into some research on whether psilocybin may help us with our parenting game. And I'm not a parent myself, but I was just like to give that disclaimer. But what I do hear from other women is that they find that when they've used psilocybin, again, they're not like doing drugs with their kids or anything, but it's like, they go off, do a journey, and then maybe they come back and they enjoy play a little bit more. They feel a little bit more present with their children, or they feel less reactive. And this applies to all parents, not just women. It's just I've been talking to women mostly. So, and then the other thing I wanted to share with that is that in terms of ACEs, again, we can pass trauma down to our children. If you've had I will say that 1 in 6 adults has had 4 or more ACEs. And if you've had 4 or more ACEs, your children are 3-fold more likely to have 4 or more ACEs. We can pass trauma down in multiple ways. It actually changes our genetics, and then we pass it down through our genes. There's tons of research on epigenetics to support this. And then there's also just the aspect of if you grew up in a very reactive household, that might be the way that parenting was modeled to you. And then you model that to your child, and it creates trauma, even though you're not intentionally trying to traumatize your children. It just can happen. And so I see a lot of potential for psychedelics to help with combating these ACEs or helping to stop these cycles of trauma. If we heal from our own ACEs, we're less likely to pass them down to our children, which is, I think, really important to consider. I did want to circle back to sexual dysfunction because I said I was going to do that, and then I forgot when I was talking about menopause. But sexual dysfunction is something that there's potential there for psilocybin to help. So 2 things that are protective against female sexual dysfunction are having a positive body image, and then also having intimate partner communication. These 2 things can be really protective against female sexual dysfunction. And we do know that psilocybin is being studied for things like eating disorders, such as anorexia. It's very much being studied for anorexia nervosa right now, even though there are 11 different types of eating disorders. This is the one that the main focus is on. And we are learning that it is having positive effects on anorexia nervosa. So it can help with body image, and there's brain science to support that. And it makes sense from a scientific perspective. And then also with intimate partner communication. So if you recall from my reading, I talked about points of light making me feel connected to everyone that I know and love. That can happen. You can feel exponentially more connected to people, even if you don't do a psychedelic with your partner in that context. You can go off and do it alone and then come back and feel exponentially more connected to the person that you're with. And so again, those 2 things are protective: positive body image and having intimate partner communication. So I see a lot of potential there for psilocybin to be able to facilitate some of that. So gosh, I've been talking quite a bit. There are some safety considerations, and so I'll maybe share those, and then we can, dive into some questions that you all have, and I'll answer those instead of me just yammering on here. But in terms of safety, I do have an entire safety chapter in the book. I share about what conditions might make you stop and think, okay, if I'm going to use psilocybin, I should do this with a medical professional. So maybe in a clinical trial context, or working with a medical professional in psychedelic assisted therapy. So I list those conditions, and those include heart conditions. And that's simply because psilocybin does increase your blood pressure and heart rate just temporarily while you're on the mushroom. So something to consider. If you do have a mental health condition, I would strongly encourage you to work with a mental health professional, because psychedelics can be very destabilizing in the moment. Even though they have beneficial effects, you may need to do that in a very controlled setting. In fact, that can be really beneficial to people in general. I did my journey with a an experienced guide. And that's the way that I felt the most safe, because I knew that if something came up for me, that this person would be able to help me. By the way, I'm always willing to share my person. His name is Gabriel Castillo, and he operates a company called Finally Detached. It's a small organization, but I felt very safe. The other safety consideration that I do want to bring up, and I have a whole chapter on this, is consent in psychedelic sessions. So if you're working with a therapist or a guide or anything like that, sex should be completely off the table. That's not a thing that should happen in a psychedelic setting, with a, with a guide or therapist and whatnot. But there are issues with sexual assault. This has happened. If anyone wants to learn more about what's happening in the industry, and sexual assault happens in every industry, so I'm really not surprised it's happening in the psychedelic industry. But you can listen to a podcast called Cover Story Power Trip, and that's put out by New York Magazine. And there's the host, her name is Dr. Lily K. Ross, and she's amazing in describing the details of what has gone on. I don't want to say that to scare you. What I do say is that it's like anything, we have to be on our guard about it. And again, consent is not on the onus of the patient or the client. It's on the onus of the guide or therapist. But discussions of consent should be had about therapeutic touch. So what might be acceptable in a psychedelic setting, if you're open to it, is if something negative or difficult would come up for you, started to have a difficult experience, you could, maybe the therapist would say, would you be okay with therapeutic touch of me holding your hand if something difficult comes up? And so you may agree to that, you may not. That's totally up to you. I was just explaining why would touch even be a topic. That's why. So again, there's a lot of information about consent and how to navigate that in psychedelic sessions. So I shared that in the book, along with other additional safety info about medications that you're on and that sort of thing. So with that, I'm going to end my talk, and I want to open the floor to questions from all of you. So I will bring Patricia back.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Jennifer. What a great reading selection, and what a robust and comprehensive overview with great specific examples. So really want to say that. And I definitely have a question that came in via email, and this is connected to microdosing. And the question is from Nora. Is smoking cannabis okay while microdosing, or does it affect the mushrooms?
Yeah, if you are using cannabis while microdosing, that should be fine. You're at such a small dose of the microdose that that you would be okay with that. I tend to, like in a deeper journey though, I tend to be like a purist where like, no, I'm only on this one drug at one time, I'm not mixing a bunch of things together. Now, people do sometimes use cannabis in journeys, especially on the downswing. So after you've had the bulk of your journey, and maybe there's still a little mushroom in your system, but you're trying to like come down from it, some people do use cannabis for that. And so, I mean, I totally say that's fine, but just, I would say be careful not to mix too many things at once, because you want to know what works for you.
And when you are thinking about your book, how did you get your start? Was this, did this start out as a book project, or was it something else?
It kind of came to me in a weird, happy surprise, happy accident. So, yeah, as I've been a journalist for a long time in the medical science and medical space, and I've written about psychedelics a little bit here and there for different news outlets. And I've always been fascinated by psychedelics. And I'm super passionate about women's health because I have endometriosis and have dealt with the medical system for a long time. And so when I saw that someone was looking for someone to write a book about, there was a publisher that had put a call out for someone to write a book about psychedelics for women specifically. I jumped at the opportunity. I reached out. I threw my name in the ring, and I kind of didn't think anything of it. I just forgot about it. And then the next week they contacted me and said, yeah, we think you're a really great fit. And suddenly I was in contract negotiations for my book. And it was crazy. I happened to be visiting my parents who live up in North Dakota at the time. And so I was like, Mom and Dad, I got a book deal. It's so exciting. And they're like, what are you writing about? I'm like, drugs. But they totally understood, and I explained the situation, what all the research that's coming out. They were like, yay, so yeah, just kind of a funny little happy accident, but it's been such a wild, fun ride.
Was there something in this subject that you learned during the research phase, or even in the time where you got feedback from edits, that really surprised you or challenged your initial assumptions or thinking?
Yeah, I think that the stuff that really resonated with me was digging into all of the neuroscience or the neurobiology of what is actually happening in your brain. Because I think, when we hear about, oh, mushrooms can help with PTSD or whatever, it's a very abstract concept. Like, how can getting high help you? How can getting high and doing drugs help you with these things? And then so digging into that brain science, it makes complete sense to me. And I think the cool thing is that when you are using psilocybin, it's not like it's doing something, wild to your brain. It's just working on what's in your brain already. So if you've got a trauma that you've been avoiding, but you really do need to work on that, the mushroom will have you focus on that because it's something that's in your subconscious, always sort of nagging at you. And so it will help you navigate that. And I think that's such a cool thing.
What is your writing process, and did it evolve over time?
Okay. Yeah. So I really had quite a quick time frame to get this all done. It was a fast deadline. I got the book deal last June, and then I had until the end of November to write. So I only had 5 months, and I was teaching 3 classes at the same time and doing a bunch of other freelance work. So I don't recommend this to any writers out there, but I didn't take a single day off. I was just working every day, even through the weekend. And that was a little bit wild, but when I would get into that, when I would be writing for the book, I got into the zone. We talk about these flow states that you can get into, and when I'm writing about something science and medical based, and I'm digging into the research, I am so in the zone. I'm like, nobody else talk to me, I'm busy. My husband's like, what do you want for dinner? I'm like, bleh, bleh. I don't have time to eat. No, I'm kidding, but yeah. And I would say, has my process evolved over time? Yeah, I think so. I think this was one of the first times in writing that I really I planned everything out before I dug into the research, and so a lot of times I start researching and then build the article from there if I'm writing an article. But as a book, I felt like I really needed a skeleton plan, and then I filled things in as I went along, and that was so helpful. And if there are any other writers out there, I used Scrivener, which is a really great writing software, and that helps you. You can see all the moving parts at once. You can see an overview, or you can really zoom in on your work, and it takes away the idea that we have to write a book from start to finish in linear order, like chapter 1, chapter 2. I was bouncing all over the place, and it was a magical software for me to be using for that. Great question.
When you received your edits and your peer review elements of it, what's one of the pieces of feedback that you thought was very helpful and may have been integral to making your book ultimately achieve what you wanted it to?
Yeah, I think that's just one of the things that happens when somebody else reads your work. We get into our work and we're so focused on things that we're not seeing the little issues with it. And so the feedback that I received was just like, tell me more about this, or this needs a little bit more explanation, or this was confusing. And it was really helpful to know which parts were like that, because it made all perfect sense in my head, right, as the writer and the one that dug into the research, but it didn't necessarily always translate elsewhere. I think the funny thing about the writing process and the editing process was, and my editor was great, was I'm a copy editor. That's what I teach at the university level. And then I'm a freelance copy editor as well. And so when I was getting copy edits back, and then somebody put a comma here and I'm like, comma doesn't go there. I got real haughty about it. Not mean to my editor or anything, but I was overthinking it constantly, because you just do with a book baby, I think.
Sure. I hope that wasn't an Oxford comma dispute that got
No.
nasty.
No, it was not. It was definitely like a weird usage of comma, like a weird thing that happens sometimes in writing with commas, and something that I teach my students about. So yeah.
When you think about your book, now that you're on the other side of it, what do you hope that people take away from the book, and maybe where you hope they'll go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big takeaway here is just understanding how different the female body is from the male body. And when we are dealing with anything medical, a lot of the history and the research previously has come from looking at the male body. So I've recently been writing about menopause quite a bit, unrelated to psychedelics. But there's actually so little information out there in medical studies on menopause, which is alarming. So I was trying to understand the nature of like, why do we get a hot flash? What happens in the body and the brain during a hot flash? And there's not a lot of information out there. I was able to find some stuff and explain the mechanism in the article that I was working on. But I think, yeah, the big takeaway is that we have different bodies. So I certainly want researchers to know that and start studying the female body, hint, hint. And then the other thing is just that I do want women to know that you're not alone if you've been gaslit at the doctor's office or had your symptoms from something completely discounted. That has happened to me many, many times for a condition that I have absolute proof exists in my body, but I've been told it's all in my head. That is something that does happen. And I want people to know you can advocate for yourself. You can find a different doctor. You can tell that doctor that they're problematic. I've certainly done that before. I've fired doctors and gone to other ones. So I just want people to be aware that you can do that. You can fire your doctor.
That's a really important statement to make. I think it's very difficult to say, you know what, this is not this doctor-patient relationship isn't working, and we need to
Absolutely.
break up.
We need to break up. This relationship status is over.
Conscious
Yes.
uncoupling.
Conscious uncoupling with your doctor. Yes, absolutely. Love
But
that.
I'm going to do one more little check here about
Okay.
questions, and then just any concluding thoughts. And I'd love it if you'd also include, please, for our audience, what's next for you?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. I'll start with that, and then I'll come back with my concluding thoughts. So, yeah, everyone's like, "What are you doing next? Are you writing another book?" And I'm like, "I just finished this one. I'm still promoting it. Let me breathe for a minute." But I do plan to put a book proposal together and start shopping that around. I'm really excited about it. It will definitely be a focus on women's health. I don't want to say much more about that, but I am so passionate now, and I'm on my soapbox about women's health, and I'm going to stay on it.
Great, good.
Yeah. And then in sort of closing thoughts, I really meant to mention this in my talk, but was running out of time. With psychedelics, there are three terms that I wanted to share, and that is set, setting, and integration. So if you are thinking about doing a psychedelic journey, the set and setting are really important before you go into it. And then the integration is really important after. Set is your mindset. So we can think of like our mindset going when we're at a yoga class, they ask us to set an intention, right? You can set an intention before going into a journey. But the probably the best intention to set is just to being open to the experience. Because if resistance comes up, if you're resistant to where the mushroom is going to take you in your mind, that can create a lot of anxiety you're more likely to have a bad trip or a bad experience, which does happen. It's just oftentimes a challenging experience. But even if people have challenging experiences, there's research out there, survey results saying that it's still one of the most profound experiences of their lives. And I can attest to that. I did have a challenging part of my experience, and it ranks right up there with one of the most profound things I've ever gone through. And then setting is what's around you. So are you inside? Are you outside? Do you have comfy pillows around you? Do you feel safe? Who's around you? And that's really important too, because you do want to feel safe. So, we hear all these stories of people going and doing mushrooms at a festival or something like that. Nothing wrong with that. But if it's your first time, I wouldn't probably recommend that, especially if you're trying to work on something, if you are working on trauma, because a festival can be so stimulating, it can be overstimulating on mushrooms. And then integration finally is what happens after the journey. So integration is the process of learning from your experience after you've done a journey. And so that might be, looking at what came up for you during your journey. And so you might be journaling as part of integration, or you might go and talk to a psychedelic integration therapist. There are therapists out there that actually do this with patients. You might join an integration community or a circle. There are plenty of them all over the country. If you just start Googling that in your area, you'll find them. And so I think that's really important, is to integrate, because otherwise, if you aren't thinking about what really happened during your journey, you're not going to learn from it. And the other thing to consider is that right after a journey, we had this period of increased neuroplasticity where our brains have just like grown and done all these really cool things. And so this is a great time to implement behavior change. So if we go back to that idea of having social anxiety, if this is now you've learned, okay, social events are safe and I should be going and I'm a good person and people like me, it's easier said than done, right? To then go step out and go to that party. But after using a psychedelic, that's a great time to start implementing that behavior change, because then it will stick. So just something to share there. Thank you.
Setting integration.
Yes, you nailed it.
Good. Well, I want to thank you so much, Jennifer Chesak, for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to learn about the psilocybin. Oh my gosh.
Tough word. It's a tough word.
I did it well at the beginning, I think, but the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, How Magic Mushrooms, Psychedelic Therapy, and Microdosing Can Benefit Your Mental, Physical, and Spiritual Health. And this is a part of the Guides to Psychedelics and More series. And congratulations on this first book. And it was a pleasure to have you at this Malaprop's virtual event. And with your next book, I hope you'll join us again.
I absolutely will. Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to come visit you in December. I'll be there.
Good. I look forward to it. Good night, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining.